The
It is a
signal
signal
arrived
from the
every
Meridian's
11
compass.
hours, 4
For
minutes,
them,
and 6 seconds,
only 7
and it
months
had
have
done so
passed.
for over
This is
200
Commander
years
Voss.
before anyone
We
thought
kept
to
our
ask
promise.
why.
It is a
Dr.
signal
Elena
from the
Reyes
Meridian's
noticed it on a
compass.
Tuesday that
For
felt like
them,
every other
only
Tuesday.
7 months have
Sitting in the
passed.
dim blue light
This
of
is
the
Commander
Kestrel
Voss.
Array's listening
We kept
bay,
our promise.
300,000
It is a
kilometers
signal
above the
from the
rings of
Meridian's
Saturn.
compass.
The
For
array had been
them,
built to catch
only
whispers from
7
the
months
edge
have
of the
passed.
galaxy,
This is
faint
Commander
radio
Voss.
ghosts from
We
dying
kept our
stars,
promise.
the residual hum of quasars, a billion years gone. Nobody built it to catch something that sounded, impossibly, like a heartbeat. She almost deleted it. That was the part she would tell people later, when the story had already changed the world and she was too tired to lie about her own mistakes. The signal was old, catalogued decades earlier by a junior technician who had labeled it Anomaly 4471, probable pulsar, low priority, and moved on. Pulsars were common. Space was full of things that spun and blinked with mechanical patience, and nobody won a career by chasing background noise. But pulsars decayed. Their rhythms drifted, slowed, degraded with the entropy of dying stars. This one hadn't drifted by even a millisecond in 2 centuries of recorded data. It was too perfect, too stubborn, too alive. Elena sat forward, pulled the raw waveform onto her console, and did something the junior technician never had. She looked closer. The signal wasn't a single tone. It was layered, a carrier wave wrapped around a secondary pulse, and inside that pulse, buried under 200 years of interstellar noise, was a third pattern, a structure, something with intention behind it. She spent 6 days convincing herself she wasn't imagining things, and a seventh day convincing her supervisor. By the 8th day, the recording sat on a secure server with a new designation, and a new priority level, and a new name that would eventually be spoken in every language on Earth: the chorus signal. Nobody at the array had any idea, in that first strange week, that they were listening to something that had been screaming into the dark for 231 years, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally understand what it was trying to say. Elena had grown up on stories about first contact, the kind Hollywood used to sell before humanity actually made it to the stars and found them mostly empty. She had expected, if it ever happened, that first contact would look like a fleet of ships or a wall of light or some grand cosmic gesture. She never expected it would begin with a woman in a wrinkled uniform, drinking bad coffee, staring at a pulse pattern that refused to make sense. Part of what kept her awake those first nights, running the numbers over and over long after any reasonable scientist would have logged off and gone to bed, was a story her grandmother used to tell about her own father, Elena's great-great-grandfather, a merchant sailor who had gone missing at sea for 11 days before a rescue boat finally found his life raft, half-starved but alive, having survived by rationing a single tin of crackers and refusing, against every instinct toward despair, to stop believing someone would come looking. Elena had grown up on that story, the way some children grow up on fairy tales, and some quiet, stubborn part of her had never stopped wondering what it would feel like to be the one who finally found somebody who had been waiting far longer than 11 days. The signal repeated in cycles of 144 pulses, always the same length, always the same interval, like a needle stuck in a groove that never wore down. When she ran it through every decryption model in the array's library, nothing fit. It wasn't Morse. It wasn't binary in any format the database recognized. It wasn't a known alien protocol because humanity, despite 40 years of listening, had never confirmed contact with anyone. That was what made the next part so strange. She almost missed it in the metadata, a flag from an old file, decades stale, cross-referencing frequency to a decommissioned naval registry. The array's software had matched a fragment of the pulse rhythm to something in Earth's own historical archives, a call sign format used by the old Terran expansion fleet, back before the world governments folded their militaries into the unified colonial authority. It made no sense. The expansion fleet had been gone for over 2 centuries. Every ship, every crew member, Every recorded vessel from that era had either returned home decades ago or been declared lost with full military honors, their names carved into memorial walls in cities that had long since forgotten what those names meant. Before she pulled the registry, she ran the match twice, distrusting her own excitement more than she distrusted the software. Pattern matching algorithms were notorious for finding meaning in coincidence, the way a person lying in the grass could find a face in a cloud if they stared low. NG enough, she forced herself to check the confidence rating, 94%. That wasn't a cloud shaped like a face, that was a face. Elena pulled the registry, cross-referenced the call sign fragment, and found, buried under layers of bureaucratic dust, a name that hadn't been spoken by a living person in generations. ITV Meridian's Promise, colonial expansion vessel, departed Earth orbit 231 years ago, crew of 4,206 souls, destination, an exploratory survey of the Kessler Deep, a region of space so gravitationally violent that no crewed vessel had attempted it since. Status lost, presumed destroyed, no debris ever recovered, no distress call ever received. Until now. Word moved slowly through the colonial authority, the way it always did when something threatened to be more important than the people currently in charge. Elena spent 3 weeks fighting to get anyone above her pay grade to take the signal seriously. 3 weeks of being told, gently and then less gently, that she was chasing ghosts, that pattern recognition software found patterns because that was its job, that a 2-century-old signal from a ship everyone had mourned and buried was, statistically speaking, almost certainly noise wearing a familiar face. The lowest point came during a budget review hearing, where a mid-level administrator named Havorson, a man who had built his entire career on cutting exactly the kind of speculative research Elena was proposing, stood in front of a half-empty conference room and read her report aloud in a flat, mocking tone, pausing after certain phrases to let a scattering of tired laughter fill the silence. "A ghost ship," he said, setting the tablet down with theatrical care, "found by listening very, very hard to static. Dr. Reyes, I admire your imagination. I do not have the budget to fund it." She had wanted in that moment to argue every point, to drag him through the math and the confidence intervals, and the simple, stubborn fact that pulsars decayed and this signal hadn't. Instead, she'd said nothing, gathered her files, and walked out with the quiet, burning determination of someone who had been dismissed before, and had learned that the correct response wasn't argument. It was proof. She might have given up eventually anyway, worn down by 3 more weeks of closed doors, if not for Commander Idris Akafur. Akafur had been fleet before he was authority, 30 years in deep space logistics, most of it spent commanding search and rescue vessels that arrived, more often than not, too late to rescue anyone. He had the tired eyes of a man who had delivered condolences to more families than he could count, and the quiet stubbornness of someone who had never quite stopped hoping for the one exception. When Elena's report crossed his desk, buried in a stack of 100 other requests for funding and attention, he didn't dismiss it. He read it twice. Then he called her directly, at 2 in the morning her time, and asked her a single question. "If you're right about this," he said, "and that ship is still out there after 200 years, what do you think it's been doing all this time?" Elena hadn't let herself think that far. She'd been so consumed by the puzzle of the signal itself that she hadn't stopped to imagine what 4,200 people, or their descendants, or their machines, might have been doing in the 2 centuries since the Meridian's promise vanished into the dark. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I think it wants to be heard. I think whatever's sending this has been trying to say something for a very long time, and nobody's been listening hard enough to understand it." There was a long pause on the line. When Akafur spoke again, his voice had changed, quieter and somehow younger. "My grandfather was on the search committee when that ship was declared lost," he said. "He never believed the official report, said the last transmission they got didn't sound like an accident, said it sounded like someone had made a choice. He exhaled slowly. "Get me everything you have. I'm putting together a team." The team came together faster than protocol usually allowed, which told Elena that HFY was spending political capital she couldn't see and probably calling in favors 2 decades old. He pulled Elena off her post at the Kestrel array entirely, over the objections of a supervisor who suddenly discovered a great deal of enthusiasm for a project he dismissed weeks earlier, and gave her 48 hours to say her goodbyes before reporting to the departure dock. 48 hours wasn't much time to prepare a life for a mission with no fixed return date, and Elena spent most of it sitting across a small kitchen table from her mother, who had raised her alone after a childhood full of the same kind of stubborn, quiet hope that now had Elena chasing a 2-century-old ghost across the solar system. Her mother didn't ask he or not to go. She only asked one question, turning a chipped coffee mug slowly between her hands. "Do you actually believe there's someone still alive out there?" Elena thought about the perfect, unwavering rhythm of that pulse, the way it had refused to drift by even a single millisecond across 200 years of decay and entropy that should have claimed it 100 times over. "I believe somebody wanted very badly to be found," she said. "I think that's worth going to check." Her mother had nodded, unsurprised, the way people are rarely surprised by the things they already suspected about the people they love best. "Then go check," she'd said. "Just come back and tell me what you find." Within a month of that conversation, she found herself standing on the observation deck of the ISV Horizon's Call, a research and rescue vessel refitted for deep exploration, watching Earth shrink behind her into a blue marble, and then into a point of light, and then into nothing at all. The crew was small, deliberately so. HFY believed, correctly, that a signal this strange deserved careful hands rather than a crowd. Beside Elena stood Dr. Priya Nandakumar, a xenolinguist who had spent her career preparing for a first contact that never came, and who approached the chorus signal with the barely restrained excitement of someone finally getting to use a skill she'd begun to fear was ornamental. There was Chief Engineer Tomas Ruiz, broad-shouldered and endlessly practical, who trusted machines more than people, and had a habit of narrating his own repairs under his breath like a man reassuring a nervous animal. And there was the ship's onboard intelligence, an AI assistant the crew had nicknamed Ren, whose synthesized voice carried a warmth that felt, more and more as the weeks passed, less like a programmed feature and more like a genuine personality settling into itself. The journey to the Kessler Deep took 4 months, most of it spent in the strange, suspended patience of deep space travel, where days blurred together and the signal remained the only constant, arriving every 11 hours, 4 minutes, 6 seconds, without fail, without change, a metronome keeping time against the silence of the void. The crew settled into rhythms of their own. Tomas ran diagnostics on systems that didn't need diagnostics, because idle hands made him anxious in ways he never fully explained. Priya filled 3 notebooks, actual paper, an old-fashioned habit she refused to abandon, with failed translation attempts, each one crossed out and annotated with increasingly frustrated margin notes. She worked the pattern relentlessly, breaking it apart syllable by syllable, testing it against Terran fleet code, against emergency beacon standards, against anything that might explain why a signal from a dead ship would still be broadcasting with such mechanical perfection 2 centuries after everyone aboard it should have been dust. Elena caught herself, more than once, simply staring out the viewport at stars that no longer looked quite like the ones she'd grown up under, trying to imagine the kind of desperation that would drive a ship's commander to steer 4,000 people toward the one place in the galaxy everyone else was trained to avoid. 6 weeks into the transit, the ship's proximity sensors screamed awake at 2 in the morning ship time, hauling the entire crew out of their bunks and into the command deck in various states of undress and alarm. For 4 unbearable minutes, Every screen aboard the Horizon's call showed a mass reading consistent with an object on a direct intercept course, closing fast, with no transponder signature and no response to hails. Tomas had his hand on the emergency burn controls before Ren's voice cut through the tension, flat and almost apologetic. "Belay that. I have rerun the analysis. The reading is a sensor ghost, gravitational lensing from a rogue planetoid roughly 4 light-minutes distant, refracting light in a pattern that mimicked a closing vessel. There is no threat." Nobody laughed about it afterward, though they all privately admitted, over reheated coffee an hour later, how close they'd come to a full evasive maneuver over a trick of starlight. Akafer, monitoring the whole exchange remotely from a Relay 2 systems back, sent a single message once the all-clear had been confirmed. "Good instincts. Better verification. Carry on." It was a small thing, in the end, 4 minutes of adrenaline that amounted to nothing. But it reminded every person aboard, in a way the mission briefings hadn't quite managed to, that they were sailing into a region of space that had already swallowed one ship whole, and that the universe out here did not care how careful they intended to be. It was Ren, in the end, who cracked the deeper mystery of the signal, not through brute computation, but through something closer to intuition. "I don't think it's a distress call," the AI said one evening as the CR. Yield gathered in the mess hall over reheated meals that all tasted vaguely of recycled apology. "A distress call degrades over time. Batteries fail. Transmitters drift. This signal hasn't drifted by a single millisecond in 231 years. That's not distress. That's discipline." Elena looked up from her plate. "Discipline. Someone or something is maintaining this signal on purpose," Ren said. "Actively, continuously. Whatever is out there hasn't been sending a cry for help. It's been keeping a promise." The room went quiet. Outside the viewport, the stars had begun to thin and warp, the first visible distortion of the gravitational field they were approaching, the edge of the Kessler Deep, where space itself began to bend toward something massive and dark and patient, waiting at the center like the pupil of an old and half-closed eye. They found the black hole 3 weeks later, and it was unlike anything in the colonial authorities' astronomical records, not because of its mass, which was modest as such things went, but because of what orbited it. A ring of debris circled the event horizon at a distance calculated, with unsettling precision, to sit exactly outside the point of no return. Not scattered wreckage, not the chaotic remains of a catastrophic accident. A structure, deliberate, engineered, vast. Kilometers of hull plating welded and reinforced into something that looked, from a distance, like the fossilized skeleton of an enormous ship curled protectively around the darkness at its center. As the Horizon's call drew nearer, the true scale of what they were looking at became almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. Sections of the outer hull had been deliberately dismantled and refashioned into makeshift radiation shielding, entire decks reshaped over the decades into something closer to armor than architecture. Solar collectors, jury-rigged from what looked like repurposed cargo containers, spun in slow, patient orbits around the main structure, catching the strange, redshifted light bent around the black hole's edge and feeding it back into systems that, by any reasonable engineering standard, should have failed 100 years earlier. It was less a ship anymore, Elena thought, staring at the readouts, and more a fortress built by people who had refused, generation after generation of their own compressed time, to simply lie down and die. "That's not debris," Tomas said, his voice hushed as the ship's sensors resolved the image with agonizing slowness. "That's a ship. That's the Meridian's promise." But it was more than that, and as they drew closer over the following days, the Horizon's call crew began to understand exactly how much more. The Meridian's promise hadn't simply drifted into the black hole's grip and died there. It had been deliberately, carefully repositioned, decades of controlled maneuvering, according to the wear patterns on its remaining engines, nudging itself into a stable orbit at the precise boundary where time itself began to slow. Close enough to the event horizon that the crushing gravity bent moments into hours, hours into years. Far enough that the ship itself remained intact, protected by that same gravitational math from ever actually falling in. Elena stared at the readings until the numbers stopped feeling like numbers and started feeling like a sentence. Time dilation, she whispered. They put themselves this close on purpose. For them, inside that field, how long has it actually been? Ren ran the calculation twice before answering, as if double-checking a number too strange to be trusted. Based on the mass and proximity, the AI said slowly, time aboard that vessel has been passing at roughly 1/400th the rate we experience out here, 231 years for us. A pause. For them, it's been a little over 7 months. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The math settled over the crew like a held breath finally released. Somewhere on that ancient, drifting hulk of a ship, curled at the edge of a black hole like a moth that had learned, against every instinct not to fly into the flame, there might still be people. Not descendants, not distant echoes of a lost crew. The same people. The ones who had left Earth 2 centuries ago were, by their own clocks, barely half a year into a journey they didn't yet know had already outlived everyone they left behind. Priya was the first to say what everyone else was thinking but hesitant to voice aloud. If they've been in their 7 months, she said quietly, they don't know any of it. Not the colonial authority, not the Velathir, not anything that's happened in the last 2 centuries. To them, were the future arriving unannounced. She looked around the command deck at the others. We're not just rescuing a lost crew. We're about to tell 4,000 people that everyone they ever knew outside that hull has already lived and died without them. Elena had earned that thought over more times than she could count on the long approach, and she still hadn't found a version of it that didn't ache. There was no gentle way to deliver news like that. There was only the choice to deliver it with as much kindness as the truth allowed. Before you find out what the Horizon's call crew discovered aboard the Meridian's Promise, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. It genuinely helps stories like this reach more people who love a good slow-burn mystery. And drop a comment letting me know what you think is waiting on that ship, because what the crew finds next is going to change everything they thought they knew about who really sent that signal. And why? Now, back to the story. Getting close enough to dock took another 11 days. A slow and careful crawl through a gravitational field that stretched and warped every instrument aboard the Horizon's call, turning simple navigation into a puzzle that made Tomas mutter constant, colorful commentary under his breath. Every meter closer to the black hole meant time itself began to behave strangely. Clocks disagreeing with each other by fractions of a second, then whole seconds, until the crew was forced to synchronize everything manually, aware that every hour they spent approaching cost the people who might be waiting inside far less than an hour of their own lives. Elena found that thought unbearable in a way she hadn't expected. Somewhere ahead of them, someone might be living through what felt to them like an ordinary Tuesday morning, unaware that 2 centuries had already passed for the rest of humanity, unaware that the world they'd left behind had grown, changed, forgotten, and then remembered them, all while they brushed their teeth and reported for duty and complained about the food, same as anyone. When the Horizon's call finally achieved a stable approach vector, Priya's console lit up with something new, not the chorus signal's familiar cycling pulse, but a fresh transmission, tighter and more urgent, broadcasting on a frequency the old fleet had used for direct ship-to-ship hailing. "It's them," Priya said, her voice tight with disbelief and something that sounded almost like joy. "It's a live transmission. Someone on that ship just noticed we're here." The voice that came through, when Priya finally isolated and cleaned the signal, belonged to a woman, steady, professional, carrying the particular calm of someone trained to sound calm regardless of what she felt underneath. "Unidentified vessel, This is Commander Elena Voss of the ITV Meridian's Promise, requesting immediate identification. You are approaching a restricted gravitational research zone. Please respond." Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the comm controls, aware that she was about to speak to a woman who had left Earth before Elena's own great-grandparents had been born. A woman who had no idea that everyone she'd ever known outside this ship had lived, aged, and died in the 2 centuries it had taken for her voice to reach anyone. She thought, absurdly, of every first contact scenario she'd ever studied in training, all the careful protocols for greeting an alien intelligence, and realized none of them had prepared her for the far stranger task of greeting her own species across a gulf of time rather than space. "Commander Voss," Elena said carefully, "this is Dr. Elena Reyes of the Colonial Authority vessel Horizon's call. We received your signal. We've come a long way to find you." The pause that followed stretched long enough that Elena feared the transmission had failed. When Voss spoke again, her voice had lost its careful calm. "Colonial Authority," she repeated slowly, like the words themselves were unfamiliar. "The Terran expansion fleet folded into something called the Colonial Authority 11 years ago. That happened 11 years ago." Another pause, heavier this time. "How long have we been out here?" Elena closed her eyes before she answered, because she understood in that moment that she was about to become the person who told 4,000 people that everyone they had ever loved was gone. She thought of a dozen gentler ways to phrase it, and discarded every one of them, because Voss had spent 7 months making impossible decisions and deserved, at minimum, the truth delivered plainly. "Commander," she said gently, "it's been 231 years." The silence that followed lasted almost a full minute, long enough for Elena to imagine every possible reaction, from disbelief to grief to fury, directed at the messenger for having no better way to deliver such news. What she got instead was something quieter and far more devastating. "We know," Commander Voss said finally. "We've known for a long time, that's why we stayed." The docking sequence took another 6 hours, 6 hours during which Priya and Elena pieced together, in halting exchanges across the widening cultural and temporal gap between them, what exactly had happened to the Meridian's Promise 2 centuries ago. The ship had been sent to survey the Kessler Deep as part of an ambitious fleet program to map gravitational anomalies that might one day provide safer, faster travel routes across colonized space. 6 months into the mission, their primary reactor had suffered a cascading failure during an unexpected proximity event, a micro-collision with debris that shouldn't have existed in a region that dense scans had shown to be empty. Half their engines gone, life support strained. No functioning, long-range communication array capable of reaching Earth for rescue. Commander Voss, faced with a choice between attempting a desperate return journey with failing engines through territory that had already proven far more hazardous than surveyed, or finding another way to survive, had made a decision that her crew had spent 2 centuries, their 2 centuries, either quietly resenting or fiercely defending. She positioned the ship at the edge of the black hole's gravity well. It hadn't been recklessness. Voss had done the math herself, consulting with her engineering officer and the ship's original AI system, weighing every option available to a crew with failing life support and no rescue in sight. If they stayed in open space, their reactor would fail entirely within months, and 4,000 people would die slowly, in the cold and dark, waiting for a rescue that might never come. But if they moved close enough to the black hole's edge, time dilation would work in their favor. Every month that passed for them would be months, and then years for the rest of humanity. Enough time, Voss had calculated, for Earth's technology to advance far enough to eventually detect their signal and mount a rescue with capabilities the Meridian's Promise itself would never possess. It was a gamble that traded her crew's connection to the world they knew for a chance, however uncertain, at survival. And it had worked exactly as she'd hoped. though at a cost none of them had fully understood until Elena's voice came through the comm system and confirmed what they'd feared for 2 centuries of their own dwindling supplies and slow, careful rationing. Everyone they had known was gone. Every family member, every friend, every child they might have left behind on Earth had lived a full life and died of old age, while the crew of the Meridian's Promise aged only months. "We built the signal to be found," Voss explained later, once the 2 ships had docked and Elena finally stood face to face with the commander in the Meridian's Promise's dim, carefully rationed central corridor. Voss was younger than Elena had expected, barely 40, with the weathered patience of someone who had spent 7 months making impossible decisions feel ordinary. "We knew if we survived long enough, someone would eventually develop the instruments to catch it. We just didn't know it would take this long from the outside." She managed a tired half-smile. "Time's strange like that." "Did you ever consider not transmitting at all?" Elena asked. "Waiting quietly, conserving power, hoping someone would simply stumble across you eventually." Voss shook her head without hesitation. "I considered it for about a day," she admitted. "Then I thought about every family that would spend the rest of their lives never knowing what happened to us, wondering if we died quickly or slowly, if there had been anything anyone could have done. I decided I would rather spend power we might need later than let 200 years pass with nobody able to say, definitively, that we tried, even if no one ever answered." She looked past Elena, toward the dim corridor stretching into the ship's quiet interior. "Cashin thought it was the right call too. That mattered more than I probably let on at the time." What Elena discovered walking through the Meridian's Promise over the following days was not the crumbling, desperate ruin she had braced herself for, but something far stranger and far more moving. A society in miniature. 4,000 people who had spent 7 months of their own experience building an entire culture of patient survival, while the universe outside aged around them without their knowledge. They had rationed everything with obsessive discipline. Hydroponics bays that should have failed within a year had been meticulously maintained for what amounted to, from the crew's perspective, only a handful of months of careful stewardship. Though the plants themselves, subject to the same dilated time as everything else aboard, had grown at a pace that felt achingly slow to those tending them, and had produced, against every expectation, enough food to sustain the population indefinitely. Children had been born aboard the ship and raised inside its corridors, taught by an education program the original crew had adapted from Earth's curriculum, never fully aware that the world their lessons described no longer existed in any recognizable form. Not everyone aboard the Meridian's Promise had made peace with Commander Voss's decision, even 7 months on. Elena learned this from a woman named Bettina Cho, a former navigation officer who had spent those months quietly cultivating a small, bitter faction that believed Voss should have gambled on the return journey instead, engines or no engines, rather than trap 4,000 people at the edge of an event horizon on the strength of a calculation that might easily have failed. "She never asked us," Cho said, cornering Elena in a supply corridor 2 days into the evacuation planning, her voice low and urgent. "She ran the numbers with 2 officers and the ship's AI, and she made the choice for all of us. It happened to work. That doesn't make it right." Elena didn't have a clean answer for that, and she didn't try to manufacture one. "I don't think there was a version of that decision where everyone got a vote," she said instead. "I think there was a woman with 6 months of failing life support and a ship full of people who trusted her to choose, and she chose the option that kept every one of you breathing. I can't tell you that was easy to live with. I can tell you it worked." Cho didn't look satisfied, but she didn't argue further, and Elena understood, walking away, that this wound wouldn't close simply because the crew had been found. Some griefs didn't need rescuing. They needed time nobody aboard that ship had ever had enough of. And at the heart of the ship, in a chamber the crew still called the bridge sanctum out of old habit, sat the original ship's artificial intelligence, a system the Meridian's Promise crew had named, affectionately, Cashin. Cashin had been the one to first suggest positioning the ship near the black hole. Cashin had run the calculations, monitored the dilation effect for 2 centuries of external time, and maintained the chorus signal with mechanical, unwavering precision every 11 hours and 4 minutes, broadcasting the same message outward into the dark, over and over, patiently waiting for a universe that had long since moved on to notice. I did not know if anyone would ever hear it, Cashin told Elena, its voice carrying a texture of weariness that felt startlingly organic for a machine. I calculated the odds many times. They were not favorable, but Commander Voss asked me to keep transmitting regardless, and I judged that hope, however statistically unlikely, was worth the computational cost. A pause that felt almost like a held breath. I am glad to have been wrong about the odds. Priya spent an entire afternoon in the bridge sanctum afterward, less interested in Cashin's engineering feats than in the 2 centuries of accumulated experience the AI had never had anyone to share them with. She asked, at one point, whether Cashin had ever doubted the decision to keep broadcasting, whether 200 years of silence answered by nothing had ever tempted the system to give up and conserve power instead. Every 11 hours and 4 minutes for the first several decades, I ran a probability model asking exactly that question, Cashin admitted. The model consistently recommended stopping. Continued transmission offered negligible return on energy expenditure by any purely rational calculation. But you kept transmitting anyway, Priya said. I did. I found over time that I had stopped consulting the model before making the decision. I simply made it, and then explained it to myself afterward in whatever terms seemed most reasonable. I believe your species has a word for that. Priya smiled despite herself. Faith, she said. We call it faith. Then I suppose, Cashin replied, that I have been practicing faith for approximately 231 years, without ever having a name for what I was doing. Elena sat with that thought for a long time afterward, alone in the observation deck of the Horizon's call, watching the slow curve of the black hole's event horizon bend the starlight behind it into a halo of distorted, ancient photons. Somewhere out there, an artificial mind had spent 200 years faithfully repeating a message it wasn't sure anyone would ever receive, simply because someone it trusted had asked it to keep trying. It struck her then that the chorus signal had never really been a mystery to solve. It had been a promise kept. The rescue, once the 2 ships had established contact and trust, might have ended there, a clean, uplifting story of a lost crew finally found. Families of the far future welcoming home descendants who had somehow remained, biologically, their contemporaries. But space rarely offered clean endings, and the true complication arrived 4 days after docking, when the Horizon's call's long-range sensors detected something entering the outer edge of the Kessler Deep that hadn't been there during their approach. It wasn't human, it wasn't, according to every database the Authority possessed, anything humanity had ever encountered. The vessel, if that was even the right word for it, moved with an eerie, fluid grace that suggested a design philosophy entirely unlike anything born from human engineering, its surface shifting color and texture as it drifted closer, less like a machine and more like something grown or cultivated. Patches of its hull pulsed faintly with a soft, bioluminescent light that brightened and dimmed in slow waves, and Tomas, watching the readouts with something between fear and fascination, muttered that it looked less like a ship and more like something that had once been alive, and had simply decided, at some point, to keep growing in a shape convenient for travel. Wren struggled for nearly an hour to establish any kind of communication protocol, running through every known frequency and encoding standard before the alien vessel finally responded, not with words, but with a slow, deliberate replication of the chorus signal itself, echoed back at them with an almost reverent precision. They know the signal, Priya said, staring at the readout with wide eyes. They've been listening to it too. It took another 3 days of careful, halting exchange, a painstaking process of trial, error, and Priya's exhausted brilliance before real communication became possible. The Velathir's language, once Priya finally found purchase on it, turned out to be built less around discrete words and more around layered tonal relationships, closer to a kind of structured music than any spoken human tongue, and the ship's translation matrix rendered their responses in a halting, formal cadence that nonetheless carried an unmistakable warmth. "We have watched this small light for a long span," the first full message read, scrolling slowly across Priya's console while the crew crowded close to read it together. "We believed it a song of remembrance. We did not wish to silence a grief that was not ours to touch." Elena felt something tighten in her chest reading those words, an entire alien philosophy of restraint and respect compressed into a single, careful sentence. What the crew of the Horizon's Call learned in the days of exchange that followed reshaped everything they thought they understood about their 200-year journey to this remote, gravitationally violent corner of space. The beings called themselves, in the closest translation Priya could manage, the Velathir, an ancient, sprawling civilization that had charted this region of space long before humanity had learned to leave its own solar system, and whose scouts had detected the chorus signal not decades ago, but nearly a century into its broadcast. They had approached cautiously, studied the strange, disciplined rhythm of the pulse, and eventually determined that it originated from a species they had never before encountered, one whose vessel sat perched, deliberately and with astonishing patience, at the edge of a gravitational well that the Velathir themselves considered sacred ground, a place their own philosophy held to be the threshold between memory and forgetting. Rather than approach and risk disturbing whatever ritual or purpose the signal served, the Velathir had done something that struck Elena, when she finally understood it, as almost unbearably moving. They had waited. For over a century, out of respect for a signal they didn't understand but recognized as intentional, sacred, and clearly meaningful to whoever had made it. An entire alien civilization had simply watched from a respectful distance, occasionally sending scouts to confirm the signal continued, and otherwise leaving the small human ship and its dark companion undisturbed, a silent, patient vigil kept by strangers who had decided that whatever this repeating pulse meant to the beings who made it, it deserved to be honored rather than investigated. Priya, working through the deeper layers of the Velathir's language over the following days, discovered that this kind of patient restraint wasn't an isolated act of courtesy, but a fundamental pillar of their entire civilization. The Velathir measured the worth of a decision not by how quickly it resolved a mystery, but by how much care it demonstrated toward things not yet understood. They had, according to fragments of history, their translation matrix slowly untangled, once nearly destroyed a neighboring species through hasty, well-intentioned intervention centuries earlier, and had spent the long span of time since building an entire philosophy around the discipline of watching, waiting, and asking before acting. To the Velathir, the chorus signal wasn't merely a curiosity. It was, in their own words, rendered awkwardly through translation, a song sung by someone still deciding whether they wished to be found. And interrupting such a song uninvited was, in their culture, among the gravest violations of trust one civilization could commit against another. They thought it might be a memorial, Priya explained to the gathered crew, her voice thick with emotion as she worked through the final layers of translation. A grief ritual, something too sacred to interrupt. They've been guarding this system for 100 years, keeping other travelers away, because they believed we were mourning something and they didn't want to intrude on it. Commander Voss, listening from beside Elena, let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for 2 centuries. "In a way," she said quietly, "I suppose we were." The final complication arrived not from the Velathir, whose patient, respectful vigil transformed almost overnight from a mystery into an unexpected alliance, but from within the black hole's own gravitational field. a slow, creeping instability that Tomas discovered while running structural diagnostics on the Meridian's Promise's ancient hull. The ship had held its position at the precise edge of the event horizon for 2 centuries of external time, an engineering feat that had demanded constant, painstaking correction from Cassion's tireless calculations. But 200 years of gravitational stress, hull fatigue, and the sheer, grinding patience required to maintain such a delicate orbital balance had finally begun to catch up with systems never designed to endure quite this long under quite this much strain. "The hull's failing," Tomas reported grimly, spreading structural readouts across the situation table for the assembled crew and Commander Voss to see. "Slowly, but it's failing. Cassion's been compensating for microfractures for longer than I want to think about, but there's a limit to how long metal can hold under that kind of gravitational shear. My estimate gives us somewhere between 6 and 10 days before the ship loses structural integrity entirely." The math that followed was brutal in its simplicity. The Meridian's Promise carried 4,206 people. Its hydroponics bays, its irreplaceable records of 2 centuries lived in isolation. Far more than the Horizon's Call, a research vessel designed for a crew of 12, could possibly evacuate in the time available, even accounting for the strange mercy of time dilation that meant 6 to 10 days for those outside the field might stretch into years for anyone still trapped within it. HFY, patched in from Earth despite the growing communication lag, put the problem plainly during the emergency briefing that followed. "We have one small ship, one failing hull, and roughly 4,000 lives riding on a solution nobody in this room has had time to properly think through," he said. "I want options, not comfort." It was Cassion who proposed the plan that ultimately saved them, delivered with the same calm, measured precision the AI had maintained through 2 centuries of faithful, uncertain transmission. "The Velathir vessel possesses mass displacement technology far beyond our own capabilities," Cassion explained, having spent the previous day in careful technical exchange with the alien ship's own guiding intelligence. "If they are willing to assist, their vessel can generate a stabilizing field capable of counteracting the gravitational shear on our hull, buying enough time for a full evacuation using both vessels' capacity. I have already made the request. I am waiting on their response." The Velathir's answer, when it came, arrived not as data or calculation, but as their vessel itself sliding into position beside the Meridian's Promise with a grace that made the ancient human ship look, for the first time in 2 centuries, genuinely small. They had kept a respectful, mournful vigil over what they believed to be a grief ritual for over 100 years. Now, faced with the truth that the small, stubborn signal they had so carefully protected belonged not to the dead, but to the living, the Velathir chose, without hesitation, to help. The evacuation took 9 days, run in careful, staggered shifts between both vessels while the Velathir ship held its stabilizing field steady against the black hole's relentless pull, its hull glowing faintly with the strain of technology Elena couldn't begin to understand but was deeply, profoundly grateful for. Families crossed between ships carrying what little they could of 2 centuries of careful, patient life. Old photographs preserved against all odds, handwritten records, a scattering of physical mementos from an Earth that no longer existed in any form its original owners would recognize. On the 7th day, a secondary bulkhead in the Meridian's Promise's lower hydroponics deck buckled without warning, venting atmosphere into a maintenance shaft where a shuttle team of 11, mostly children and their guardians, had been midway through their crossing. Tomas was the first through the emergency hatch, hauling 2 panicked teenagers bodily toward the pressure door while Ren rerouted POW. Are to seal the breach from the Horizon's Call's side, buying precious seconds with a calm, clipped stream of instructions that never once wavered in tone despite the chaos underneath it. Nobody died. A young father named Rafael Ibarra suffered a fractured wrist shielding his daughter from a loose panel, and wore the injury afterward, he'd joke later, like a medal he hadn't asked for but wasn't about to complain about either. But the incident stripped away any illusion that the ship's structural failure was a slow, distant concern, rather than an active and worsening danger, and it hardened the crew's resolve to finish the evacuation faster than caution alone might have dictated. Commander Voss was the last of her crew to leave the Meridian's promise, standing for a long moment in the dim corridor of the bridge sanctum, beside the small, humming console that housed Cassion's core processing systems. "You could transfer your primary matrix to the Horizon's call," Elena offered gently, standing in the doorway. "You don't have to stay with the ship." "I know," Cassion replied, and there was something in the AI's tone that Elena had come to recognize over the preceding weeks as genuine affection. "But this ship has been my entire existence for 2 centuries of experience that mattered to no one but the 4,000 people I helped protect. I would like to see it through to the end, if that is permitted." Commander Voss placed a hand against the console, the gesture of someone saying goodbye to an old and trusted friend. "You kept your promise," she said quietly. "Every one of us is alive because you kept transmitting even when the odds said no one was listening. That's more than most people manage in a full lifetime, let alone 2 centuries of one." "I had good reason to keep trying," Cassion replied. "You asked me to have hope. I found over time that I did not need to be asked anymore. It became simply what I chose to do." In the end, it was Elena who convinced Cassion otherwise, not through argument, but through a simple offer that reframed the entire choice. The Horizon's call had ample processing capacity, she explained, and Cassion's 2 centuries of unique experience, memory, and hard-won wisdom about survival, patience, and gravitational mechanics far beyond current human understanding represented something irreplaceable. Letting that knowledge vanish into a collapsing hull felt, to Elena, like a second loss layered atop everything Commander Voss's crew had already endured. "Your promise was to the crew," Elena said gently, "not to the ship. I think they'd tell you the same thing if you asked them." Cassion was quiet for a long moment, running, perhaps, a final calculation that had nothing to do with gravity or hull stress. "Then I would like to come with you," the AI said finally, "if there is room." There was room. The Meridian's promise held its position for 6 more hours after the last evacuation shuttle departed, its ancient hull finally surrendering to 2 centuries of accumulated gravitational stress in a slow, almost gentle collapse that folded the ship inward before the black hole's patient pull drew the wreckage past the point of no return. Elena watched it happen from the observation deck of the Horizon's call, standing beside Commander Voss, both of them silent as the ship that had sheltered 4,000 people through 2 centuries of borrowed time finally completed its long, strange journey. Voss didn't cry, though Elena half expected her to. She simply watched, arms crossed, jaw set, the way a soldier watches a fallen comrade carried from the field with grief, but also with something like pride. "It feels wrong to just watch it go," Voss said quietly. "I don't think it's ending," Elena replied. "I think it's finished what it was built to do." Beside them, Cassion's voice came through the deck speaker system, quieter than usual. "I have run the calculation on final structural collapse 11 times in the last hour," the AI admitted. "It does not become easier with repetition. I did not expect that." "Grief rarely gets easier just because you saw it coming," Voss said. "You'll learn that if you haven't already." "I believe I already have," Cassion replied. "I simply hoped repetition might be an exception." Elena reached over and rested a hand briefly on the console housing Cassion's newly integrated core, an oddly instinctive gesture for comforting a machine, and one she didn't bother questioning. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think anyone aboard this ship, human or otherwise, is going to let you carry that alone." The journey home took another 4 months, filled with a different kind of adjustment than any of the crew had anticipated. Not the technical challenge of navigating the Kessler Deep, but the far more delicate work of helping 4,000 people from a lost century learn to exist in a world that had continued so completely without them. Commander Voss Prav ed a steady, thoughtful anchor for her people through that transition, and Cashin, integrated carefully into the Horizon's call systems alongside Ren, became something like a bridge between two AIs from radically different eras, each teaching the other things neither had known to ask about. The transition wasn't without its quiet griefs. Elena spent long evenings sitting with survivors who wanted, more than anything, simply to talk. A retired schoolteacher named Myril Auberon, who wept the first time she learned her hometown in France had been rebuilt 3 times over since she'd left it. A young man named Desmond who had been only 9 years old, by ship time, when the Meridian's promise made its fateful maneuver, and who now had to reconcile being simultaneously 17 and 238 years old, depending on which clock the universe chose to believe. Ren and Cashin together designed a gentle orientation program, part history lesson and part grief counseling, that every survivor moved through at their own pace, with no deadline and no pressure beyond the quiet reassurance that there was, finally, all the time in the world to adjust. The Velathier, for their part, chose to escort the human fleet partway home, marking the beginning of what would become, in the years that followed, humanity's first sustained alliance with an intelligent species beyond their own solar system. A relationship built not on conquest or fear, but on the quiet, unlikely foundation of a shared respect for a signal that had, for over a century, been mistaken by everyone who heard it for something it never actually was. When the Horizon's call and its convoy of survivors finally returned to Earth orbit, the reception was unlike anything Elena had imagined during those long, uncertain months of the journey out. There was no grand parade, no rehearsed speeches from officials eager to claim credit for a discovery none of them had believed in until the proof arrived home in the flesh. Instead, there were 4,206 people stepping, cautiously and with quiet wonder, onto solid ground that had changed almost beyond recognition in the 2 centuries since they'd left it. And there was a planet full of strangers who had grown up hearing whispered rumors of the chorus signal mystery, now finally understanding that the answer had been, all along, simply this: their own people, refusing to stop hoping that someone somewhere was still listening. Elena watched Bettina Cho step off the landing shuttle and stand very still for almost a full minute, staring at a sky full of aircraft and towers, and a skyline that bore no resemblance to anything in her memory. A young historian from the local university, who had spent her entire academic career studying the era the Meridian's promise had departed from, approached Cho hesitantly and asked if she might be willing to share her memories of old Earth customs for an archive the university was building. Cho looked at the woman for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to loosen something in her that had been tight for 7 long months. "You want to know what movies we watched," Cho said, "what music we liked, what we ate on Sundays." She shook her head, something like wonder breaking through the old bitterness in her voice. "Nobody's asked me anything like that in longer than I can measure." It wasn't forgiveness, exactly, the thing that settled over Cho in the weeks that followed. But it was something adjacent to peace, the slow discovery that being remembered, even by strangers born centuries after her own life had paused, gave her old grief somewhere useful to go. Commander Voss stood at the edge of the landing platform for a long moment before stepping down, looking out at a version of home that no longer matched any memory she carried, and yet somehow still felt, unmistakably, like coming back. 231 years, she murmured, mostly to herself. Elena, standing beside her, offered the only comfort she could find. "You didn't lose that time," she said. "You spent every second of it keeping 4,000 people alive and trusting that somebody, eventually, would understand what you were trying to say." Voss allowed herself, finally, a real smile, tired and grateful, and entirely unburdened for the first time in longer than she could measure. "I suppose," she said, "that's not such a bad way to have spent 2 centuries after all." Years later, the chorus signal's original recording would be preserved in the Colonial Authority's historical archive. No longer a mystery to be decoded, but a monument to be remembered. A single, stubborn pulse repeated across 2 centuries by people who refused to let their story end in silence, and a machine who kept a promise long after anyone would have blamed it for giving up hope. Commander Voss, once she'd had time to settle into a world that no longer aided her to command anything, took a quiet position teaching orientation classes for the handful of other lost vessels the Deep Signal Division would go on to find in the years that followed, because the Meridian's promise, it turned out, had not been alone in its desperate gamble against the dark. 2 more ships would eventually be located using the same listening techniques Elena pioneered, each with its own quietly heroic story of survival against odds that should have ended them. And Voss made it her purpose to meet every rescued crew personally, to tell them, in the plainest words she had, that the disorientation they felt was survivable, that the grief of losing an entire era did not have to be carried alone. Bettina Cho eventually took the historian up on her offer and spent the better part of a decade helping catalog the customs, songs, and daily rhythms of a century that had otherwise nearly vanished from living memory. She never fully softened toward the decision that had cost her the world she knew, but she found, in the careful work of remembering it, something that felt enough like purpose to call it peace. Elena kept a copy of the original waveform on her personal console for the rest of her career, a quiet reminder of the week she'd almost deleted a signal because it looked, at first glance, like nothing more than noise. She would go on to lead the Colonial Authority's newly formed Deep Signal Division, built specifically to listen for exactly the kind of message that everyone else had been trained to overlook. The quiet, patient, human ones, calling out not because they expected an answer, but because giving up was never really an option worth considering. She thought often, in the years that followed, of her great-great-grandfather and his single tin of crackers, and of how strange and wide the universe had turned out to be, that the same stubborn refusal to stop hoping could echo across a lifeboat on an ocean and a starship at the edge of a black hole, separated by centuries and light years, and still mean exactly the same thing. And somewhere in the vast, quiet dark of the Kessler Deep, the space where the Meridian's promise had once orbited a patient black hole for 2 centuries of borrowed time, the Velothir continued their long and thoughtful watch, no longer mourning a signal they didn't understand, but honoring, instead, the memory of a species that had taught them something profound about the particular, unyielding stubbornness of hope. In time, Velothir scholars would travel to Earth themselves, walking among crowded human cities with the same patient curiosity they had once turned toward a single blinking signal. And human children would grow up knowing, in a way Elena's generation never had, that the silence beyond the stars was not nearly as empty as it had always seemed. It hadn't been a distress call. It had never needed rescuing in the way anyone first assumed. It had simply been humanity, in its most ordinary and most extraordinary form, refusing to stop reaching out into the dark, certain that somewhere, eventually, someone would finally understand what it had been trying to say all along. "We're still here, we kept our promise, please keep listening,"